Marcus Chen stood convicted of the brutal murders of his cousin's wife, Jennifer Hayes, age 34, and her daughter, Emma Hayes, age 7, in their waterfront home along the Riverside community of Portland, Oregon. Each victim suffered fatal injuries in what prosecutors described as a calculated act of violence that transformed a peaceful Sunday morning into a nightmare that would reverberate through multiple families for generations to come. The setting: the crimes occurred on September 17, 2021, in the affluent Riverside district, a neighborhood known for its tree-lined streets, boutique coffee shops, and the kind of close-knit community where residents knew each other by name. The Hayes family had resided in their charming craftsman-style home for nearly 5 years. Ever since Thomas Hayes, Jennifer's husband, had accepted a position as senior architect at one of Portland's most prestigious firms. If you're following this detailed examination of one of Portland's most troubling criminal cases, please consider subscribing to support our continued coverage of stories that demand careful attention and thorough analysis. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as understanding these tragedies helps communities everywhere recognize warning signs and support those affected by similar circumstances. The day everything changed. The timeline reconstructed by investigators painted a picture of normalcy shattered without warning. Thomas Hayes had left early that Sunday morning for a company retreat in Bend, Oregon, approximately 3 hours away. He had kissed his wife and daughter goodbye around 6:30, completely unaware that he would never see them alive again. Jennifer had planned a quiet day at home with Emma, who had been excited about working on a school project about marine biology, her current obsession. Text messages recovered from Jennifer's phone showed her sending photographs to her mother around 9:15 that morning. Images of Emma arranging construction paper cutouts of dolphins and whales across the dining room table. According to phone records and witness statements later presented in court, Marcus Chen arrived at the Hayes residence at approximately 9:45 that morning. A neighbor's doorbell camera positioned across the street captured his silver sedan pulling into the driveway. The Hayes family had no external security cameras installed, a detail that would prove significant as investigators pieced together the sequence of events. Marcus was no stranger to the household. As Thomas's cousin, he had visited the home numerous times over the years, attending birthday parties, holiday gatherings, and casual family dinners. Jennifer had always welcomed him warmly, and Emma knew him as Uncle Marcus, a familiar presence in her young life. There had never been any reported conflicts or tensions, making what followed all the more incomprehensible to those who knew the family. The discovery at 3:20 that afternoon. Thomas Hayes called his wife's cell phone during a break in the retreat's afternoon session. When she didn't answer, he tried again 5 minutes later, then again at 3:35. Growing concerned after the fourth unanswered call, he texted her, asking if everything was okay. When that message also went unread and unanswered, a growing sense of unease prompted him to call their home's landline. After 10 rings with no answer, Thomas contacted his neighbor, Patricia Morrison, a retired teacher who had become close friends with Jennifer over the years. He asked if she might check on his family, explaining that Jennifer wasn't answering her phone and that while it might be nothing, he couldn't shake a feeling that something was wrong. Patricia walked across the street at 3:55, noting that Jennifer's car was in the driveway and that the front door was slightly ajar, unusual for a family that always kept their doors locked. She called out as she approached, pushing the door open when no one responded. What she discovered in the living room would haunt her for the rest of her life. Jennifer Hayes lay on the hardwood floor near the sofa, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been struck from behind. Young Emma was found in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, her school project materials scattered around her. The colorful marine life cutouts now mixed with the chaos of violence. Patricia, drawing on reserves of composure she didn't know she possessed, backed out of the house immediately and called 911 from her cell phone while standing on the front lawn. The recording of her call captured her struggle to maintain coherence while reporting what she had seen. "There's been something terrible," she told the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "Jennifer and Emma Hayes, they're hurt. I think they're dead. Please send someone right away." When the dispatcher asked if she could see the perpetrator or any sign of forced entry, Patricia responded that she had seen no one else and that the door had been unlocked when she arrived. Emergency response Portland police officers arrived at the Hayes residence at 4:07, 13 minutes after Patricia's call. They found the front door still open as she had left it, Patricia standing on the sidewalk, visibly shaken but able to provide coherent information about the family and her reason for entering the home. Officers secured the scene and confirmed what Patricia had already reported. Jennifer and Emma Hayes were deceased, victims of what appeared to be blunt force trauma. The responding officers noted immediately that despite the violence inflicted on the victims, the rest of the house showed no signs of disturbance, no forced entry, no indication of burglary or ransacking. This suggested strongly that the perpetrator had been someone known to the family, someone who had been welcomed into the home. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of Portland's Homicide Division, arrived at the scene within 40 minutes. Martinez, known throughout the department for her methodical approach and her ability to maintain professional detachment even in the most disturbing cases, would later say that the Hayes case affected her more deeply than most, perhaps because of the clear evidence that the victims had been going about an ordinary Sunday morning when violence shattered their world. Crime scene technicians began the careful process of documenting every detail while Detective Martinez conducted preliminary interviews with Patricia Morrison and other neighbors who had gathered outside the police perimeter. Patricia provided crucial information about the family's routines, Jennifer's character, and the fact that Thomas was away at a business retreat. Martinez immediately had an officer contact Thomas before he could learn of his family's deaths through other means. The call to Thomas Hayes was made at 4:35. The officer, following protocols for death notifications, told Thomas only that there had been a serious incident at his home and that he needed to return to Portland immediately. Thomas, his voice rising in panic, demanded more information, but the officer gently insisted that he should not attempt to drive while receiving such news and that detectives would meet him as soon as he arrived home. The 3-hour drive back to Portland would be the longest of Thomas Hayes' life, his mind racing through every possible scenario, none of them as terrible as the reality awaiting him. The victims. Jennifer Hayes had been born Jennifer Parker in Sacramento, California, the youngest of 3 daughters in a close-knit family. She had met Thomas Hayes during their senior year at the University of Oregon, where she studied elementary education, and he pursued his architecture degree. Friends from that time described them as genuinely well-matched, both ambitious yet family-oriented, sharing values about creating a meaningful life together. After graduation, they had married in a ceremony at Jennifer's childhood church, surrounded by the families and friends who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful partnership. For several years, Jennifer taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Portland, earning a reputation among parents and colleagues as a teacher who genuinely cared about each student's individual needs and potential. When Emma was born, Jennifer had made the decision to leave teaching temporarily, wanting to be fully present during her daughter's early years. She had remained active in educational advocacy, volunteering with literacy programs, and serving on the board of a non-profit focused on providing books to underprivileged children. Her social media presence reflected a woman who found joy in motherhood while maintaining her own interests and passions. Emma Hayes, at 7 years old, was described by everyone who knew her as bright, curious, and remarkably compassionate for her age. Her teachers at Riverside Elementary noted her enthusiasm for learning, particularly anything related to science and nature. She had recently become fascinated with marine biology, checking out every book the school library had on ocean life and watching documentaries about coral reefs and deep-sea creatures. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Allen, would later tell investigators that Emma had an unusual ability to make connections between different concepts, often asking questions that showed a level of thinking beyond her years. She was kind to classmates who struggled, often volunteering to help them with projects or inviting children who seemed left out to join her activities during recess. The Sunday morning project she had been working on when she died was a presentation about endangered ocean species, something she had been excited about for weeks. Her grandmother would later share that Emma had talked about becoming a marine biologist, wanting to help protect animals that couldn't protect themselves. The innocence of that ambition, cut short by senseless violence, would become one of the most heartbreaking details of the case. Thomas Hayes, upon receiving the devastating news upon his arrival home, was described by the officers present as a man whose entire foundation had collapsed beneath him. Detective Martinez, who had the difficult task of informing him about the deaths of his wife and daughter, later noted in her report that Thomas's reaction was that of someone experiencing a complete psychological break from reality, repeatedly insisting that there must be some mistake, that Jennifer and Emma were probably just at the store or visiting a friend. The Hayes family home reflected the life they had built together. Photographs covered the walls, documenting Emma's growth from infancy through her current age, family vacations to the Oregon coast, hiking trips in the Columbia River Gorge, and countless ordinary moments that had made up the texture of their daily lives. Children's books filled a dedicated bookshelf in Emma's room, organized by topic, with the marine biology section noticeably worn from frequent reading. Jennifer's presence was evident throughout the house in small touches: a herb garden on the kitchen windowsill, a calendar on the refrigerator filled with color-coded activities and appointments, a craft corner where she and Emma worked on projects together. The contrast between this evidence of a thriving family life and the violence that had occurred there was jarring even to experienced crime scene investigators. The investigation begins. Detective Martinez's initial assessment of the scene led to several immediate conclusions. The lack of forced entry, the absence of any stolen property, and the focused nature of the violence suggested this was not a random crime or a burglary gone wrong. This was personal, carried out by someone who had been admitted to the home willingly and who had targeted these specific victims. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chen, arrived at the scene at 5:30 to conduct preliminary observations before the bodies could be transported for complete autopsies. His initial assessment indicated that both victims had died from blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted with what appeared to be a heavy object. The pattern of injuries suggested that Jennifer had been attacked first, likely without warning, and that Emma had been struck while attempting to flee toward the bedrooms. As crime scene technicians processed the house, they discovered a bloodied baseball bat in the garage, placed on a workbench in a way that suggested someone had set it there deliberately rather than it having been dropped or discarded in panic. The bat belonged to Thomas, part of a collection of sports equipment stored in the garage. Preliminary testing confirmed the presence of blood on the bat, which would later be matched to both victims through DNA analysis. The positioning of the weapon raised immediate questions. If this had been an opportunistic crime, why would the perpetrator have taken the time to return the weapon to the garage rather than fleeing immediately or taking it with them? This suggested either extreme confidence or a level of psychological detachment that was deeply concerning. Detective Martinez dispatched officers to conduct door-to-door interviews throughout the neighborhood, while she focused on gathering information about the Hayes family's relationships. both personal and professional. Who had access to their home? Were there any ongoing disputes or conflicts? Had Jennifer or Thomas mentioned any concerns about their safety or any problems with acquaintances or family members? Neighbors uniformly described the Hayes family as well-liked and unproblematic, the kind of neighbors who kept their yard maintained, always returned borrowed items, and participated in community events. No one reported any unusual activity at the house that morning, beyond Marcus Chen's arrival, which hadn't seemed remarkable since he was known to visit the family periodically. Patricia Morrison, once she had calmed enough to provide a more detailed statement, mentioned that she had seen Marcus arrive around 9:45 that morning. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time, as his visits were not uncommon. She had been working in her own garden and hadn't paid particular attention to when or if he had left, though she was certain his car was no longer in the driveway by the time she had gone inside around 1 o'clock to make lunch. This information immediately elevated Marcus Chen to person of interest status. Detective Martinez pulled his driver's license information and discovered that he lived alone in an apartment approximately 15 minutes from the Hayes residence. Phone records showed that Marcus had called Thomas's cell phone at 2:30 that afternoon, about 2 hours before the bodies were discovered, a detail that would later prove significant. Marcus Chen's background. Marcus Chen, at age 28, had lived in Portland for 3 years, having moved from Seattle, where he had attended college and worked briefly in software development. He was Thomas Hayes' first cousin on his mother's side, and family members described their relationship as cordial, though not particularly close. They had grown up in different cities, but had reconnected when Marcus moved to Portland, with Thomas making efforts to include him in family gatherings and help him establish social connections in a new city. Marcus had struggled with employment stability since moving to Portland, working a series of contract positions in tech support and web development that never seemed to last more than a few months. Thomas had helped him find some of these positions through professional connections, and Jennifer had occasionally invited Marcus for dinner, concerned that he seemed isolated and might benefit from regular family interaction. Friends and former colleagues who were interviewed in the days following the murders provided a picture of someone who was socially awkward and occasionally difficult to work with, but not overtly aggressive or threatening. Several people mentioned that Marcus could be intense in his focus, sometimes missing social cues, and that he occasionally made comments that seemed inappropriate or off-putting, though not necessarily malicious. His last employer, a small tech startup where Marcus had worked until being let go 2 months before the murders, reported that his termination had been due to performance issues and conflicts with team members who found his communication style confrontational. The owner of the company mentioned that Marcus had not taken the termination well, sending several emails in the following weeks demanding reconsideration and making vague accusations about unfair treatment. Financial records obtained through investigative channels revealed that Marcus had been struggling economically, with credit card debt accumulating, and his bank account showing a pattern of overdrafts and minimum balance fees. While financial stress alone didn't establish motive for murder, it provided context for understanding his mental state in the months leading up to the crimes. More concerning were discoveries made when detectives obtained permission to search Marcus's apartment. His online search history revealed troubling patterns in the weeks preceding the murders, including repeated searches about crime scene investigation techniques, how police solve murders, and whether security cameras can be disabled remotely. There were also searches related to inheritance laws in Oregon and what happens to property when someone dies without a will. The interrogation detective Martinez and her partner, Detective James Wu, located Marcus Chen at his apartment at 7:15 that evening. approximately 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered. When they knocked on his door, Marcus answered promptly, showing no visible signs of distress or surprise at seeing police officers. When asked if he would be willing to come to the police station to answer some questions about his cousin's family, Marcus agreed without hesitation, even declining the detective's suggestion that he might want to call a lawyer. At the police station, Marcus was placed in an interview room equipped with video recording equipment that would capture every moment of the interrogation that followed. After being advised of his Miranda rights, which he acknowledged understanding, Marcus signed a waiver agreeing to speak without an attorney present. This decision would later be questioned by his defense team, who would argue that Marcus's social difficulties and possible psychological issues had prevented him from fully understanding the implications of proceeding without legal representation. Detective Martinez began the interview with general questions about Marcus's relationship with Thomas and Jennifer Hayes, establishing the family connection and the frequency of his visits to their home. Marcus responded in a flat, somewhat mechanical tone, providing factual answers without elaboration or emotional content. "When was the last time you saw Jennifer and Emma?" Martinez asked, her approach casual and non-confrontational in these early stages. Marcus hesitated for several seconds before responding, a pause that seemed significant to the detectives watching. "I saw them this morning," he finally said. "I went over to their house around 10 o'clock. Martinez maintained her neutral expression, despite this admission, placing Marcus at the scene during the likely time frame of the murders. "What was the purpose of your visit?" she asked. "I wanted to talk to Thomas about helping me find a new job," Marcus explained. "But Jennifer said he was away at some work thing. She invited me in anyway, said I could wait for a while and maybe we could all have lunch together." This account seemed plausible on its surface, but Martinez noted that Marcus's affect remained oddly flat for someone discussing a visit to family members who had, unknown to him, at this point in the interview, been found dead hours later. "How long did you stay at the house?" Martinez continued. "Maybe 30 minutes, Marcus replied. "Emma was working on some school project. Jennifer offered me coffee. We talked a little about my job search. Then I left." "You left around 10:30? Martinez asked, seeking to pin down the timeline. Marcus nodded. "Somewhere around then. I didn't check the exact time." Martinez then shifted her approach, asking Marcus about his activities after leaving the Hayes residence. He described returning to his apartment, watching television, and then going to a coffee shop around 1 o'clock where he had worked on updating his resume on his laptop. This could potentially be verified through coffee shop employees and transaction records, providing an alibi for the afternoon hours. "Marcus," Martinez said, her tone becoming more serious, "I need to tell you something. Jennifer and Emma Hayes were found dead this afternoon. They were murdered in their home." For the first time in the interview, Marcus showed a visible reaction, though it struck the detectives as oddly muted, given the magnitude of what he had just been told. His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, but there was no gasp of shock, no immediate questions about what had happened, no expression of grief or horror that would typically accompany learning that two family members had been violently killed. "When?" was his only question, asked after a pause that felt uncomfortably long. "They were discovered around 4 o'clock. But the medical examiner believes they died late this morning," Martinez explained, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "Based on your statement, you may have been one of the last people to see them alive." Marcus sat silently for nearly a minute, staring at the table between them. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through the room. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," he said quietly. "Everything just got out of control." Detective Martinez, maintaining her professional composure despite the significance of this statement, carefully proceeded. "What got out of control, Marcus? What happened at the house this morning?" What followed was a confession that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case, though Marcus's account of events would differ in crucial ways from the physical evidence collected at the scene. According to his version, Jennifer had said something that upset him, though he couldn't or wouldn't specify what it was. An argument had ensued, growing heated until Marcus claimed he had picked up the baseball bat from near the garage door where it had been left after Thomas and Emma had played catch the previous day. "I just wanted to scare her, make her stop saying those things," Marcus said, his voice remaining eerily calm. "But then I hit her and she fell down. Emma came running when she heard her mother scream. She was screaming too, saying she was going to call the police. I panicked. I hit her too." This account, while constituting a confession, raised more questions than it answered. What had Jennifer allegedly said that provoked such violence? Why would Emma's natural reaction to call for help drive Marcus to kill a 7-year-old child? And why did his affect remain so flat while describing these horrific acts? As Detective Martinez pressed for more details, inconsistencies began to emerge in Marcus's story. He couldn't provide a coherent explanation of what Jennifer had said to upset him. His timeline of events didn't align with the evidence found at the scene. Most significantly, his emotional responses seemed completely disconnected from the gravity of what he was describing. When asked directly why he had killed Emma, a question Martinez posed in stark terms, hoping to elicit some genuine emotional response, Marcus simply said, "She saw what happened to her mother. I couldn't leave a witness." This cold calculation, delivered in the same flat tone he had used throughout the interview, revealed something deeply troubling about Marcus's psychological state. This was not a crime of passion that had spiraled out of control. The murder of Emma Hayes had been a deliberate choice made to eliminate a witness, suggesting a level of calculation that contradicted Marcus's claims about losing control in a heated argument. The evidence builds. In the days following Marcus Chen's confession, investigators worked to build a comprehensive case that would withstand scrutiny at trial. While confessions are powerful evidence, they must be corroborated by physical evidence and cannot stand alone, particularly when they contain inconsistencies or come from suspects whose mental state might be questioned. The autopsy reports provided by Dr. Robert Chen confirmed that both Jennifer and Emma Hayes had died from blunt force trauma, resulting in catastrophic brain injuries. Jennifer had been struck multiple times on the back of her head, with the pattern of wounds suggesting she had been attacked from behind while seated or standing. She had sustained defensive wounds on her forearms, indicating she had raised her hands to protect herself, though these injuries appeared to have been inflicted after the initial blows to her head, suggesting she had attempted to defend herself even after being grievously wounded. Emma's injuries told an even more heartbreaking story. She had been struck primarily on the side and back of her head, with the wound pattern consistent with someone attempting to flee when attacked. Tissue samples under her fingernails revealed that she had scratched her attacker, likely during her final moments, providing DNA evidence that would later be matched to Marcus Chen. The murder weapon, the baseball bat found in the garage, yielded fingerprints matching both Thomas Hayes and Marcus Chen. Given that the bat belonged to Thomas and was stored in his garage, his fingerprints were expected. Marcus's fingerprints, however, were positioned in patterns consistent with gripping the bat as a weapon, and DNA analysis revealed traces of blood matching both victims mixed with perspiration that matched Marcus's genetic profile. Blood spatter analysis conducted by forensic experts revealed a story more complex than Marcus's confession suggested. The patterns indicated that the attack on Jennifer had been sustained and violent, with multiple blows struck with considerable force. The positioning of blood spatter on walls and furniture suggested she had been moving during at least part of the attack, contradicting Marcus's claim that she had simply fallen after one blow. The attack on Emma had occurred near the hallway, and the blood spatter evidence indicated she had been pursued from the dining room where she had been working on her project. Small bloody footprints, later matched to Emma's shoes, showed that she had attempted to run towards the bedrooms, perhaps seeking a phone or a place to hide. The concentrated area of blood where her body was found indicated that this was where she had ultimately been struck down. Crime scene investigators also discovered evidence that suggested the perpetrator had remained in the house for a significant period after the murders. Water traces in the kitchen sink indicated that someone had washed their hands thoroughly. There were signs that someone had moved through the house, possibly searching for something or simply trying to decide what to do next. Most damning was the discovery of Marcus's cell phone records, which placed him at the Hayes residence from 9:47 until approximately 12:30, far longer than the 30 minutes he had claimed in his initial interview. Cell tower data and GPS coordinates from his phone created a timeline that contradicted his alibi about leaving mid-morning. Even more troubling was the call Marcus had made to Thomas Hayes at 2:30 that afternoon, hours after the murders, but before the bodies were discovered. When detectives retrieved Thomas's voicemail and found a message from Marcus, they heard him saying, "Hey Thomas, just wanted to check in about maybe getting together this week. Give me a call when you get a chance." The casual tone of this message, recorded by someone who had brutally murdered his cousin's wife and child just hours earlier, demonstrated a chilling capacity for deception and emotional disconnection. The psychological evaluation. As the case moved toward trial, Marcus Chen underwent extensive psychological evaluation by experts retained by both the prosecution and defense. These evaluations would become crucial in understanding not only Marcus's mental state at the time of the murders, but also his capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his actions and his ability to assist in his own defense. Dr. Patricia Thornton, a forensic psychologist with over 20 years of experience, conducted the initial evaluation on behalf of the prosecution. Her report, which ran to nearly 60 pages, provided a detailed analysis of Marcus's psychological profile based on extensive interviews, standardized testing, and review of his personal history. According to Dr. Thornton's findings, Marcus exhibited traits consistent with several personality disorders, including narcissistic tendencies, lack of empathy, and difficulty forming normal emotional attachments. However, she concluded that these traits, while significant, did not rise to the level of legal insanity or incompetence to stand trial. Marcus understood the difference between right and wrong, could comprehend the legal proceedings against him, and was capable of assisting in his own defense, the legal standards for competency. Mr. Chen demonstrates what I would characterize as profound emotional disconnection, Dr. Thornton wrote in her report. When discussing the victims, including the 7-year-old child, he shows no signs of remorse, grief, or even discomfort. This is not the result of repression or denial, but rather appears to reflect a genuine absence of normal empathetic responses. He discusses the murders in the same tone one might use to describe a trip to the grocery store. The defense's psychological expert, the Dr. Michael Brennan, reached somewhat different conclusions while acknowledging many of the same observations. Dr. Brennan's evaluation emphasized Marcus's difficult childhood, his struggles with social integration, and what he characterized as undiagnosed and untreated mental health conditions that had likely been present for years. While Mr. Chen understood on a factual level that killing was wrong, Dr. Brennan wrote, his capacity to emotionally process this understanding and apply it to his actions was severely compromised by underlying psychological dysfunction. This is not to excuse his actions, but to provide context for understanding how someone without a previous history of violence could commit such acts. Both experts agreed on one troubling point. Marcus Chen showed virtually no genuine remorse for his actions. What expressions of regret he did offer seemed to be performative, things he understood he was supposed to say, rather than authentic emotional responses to the harm he had caused. The trial begins on April 3rd, 2023, nearly 19 months after the murders of Jennifer and Emma Hayes. Marcus Chen's trial began in Multnomah County Circuit Court. The proceedings drew significant media attention, with national news outlets sending correspondents to cover what many were calling one of Oregon's most disturbing family murder cases in recent memory. Judge Michael Richardson presided over the trial, bringing 30 years of judicial experience to a case that would test even the most seasoned legal professionals. The courtroom was filled to capacity each day, with members of both families present, along with community members who had followed the case closely since the murders. The prosecution team was led by Senior Deputy District Attorney Rachel Morrison, a prosecutor known for her careful preparation and her ability to present complex evidence in ways that juries could readily understand. Morrison had spent months preparing for trial, coordinating with forensic experts, psychological witnesses, and the detectives who had worked the case. The defense team consisted of 2 public defenders, Anthony Rodriguez and Lisa Chen, no relation to the defendant. Both experienced criminal defense attorneys who faced the challenging task of defending a client who had confessed to the crimes and whose actions seemed to defy any sympathetic explanation. Marcus Chen, now 29 years old, sat at the defense table in a dark suit, his expression as neutral as it had been throughout his interrogation. He had gained weight during his time in custody and appeared older than his years, but maintained the same eerily calm demeanor that had characterized all his interactions with law enforcement. Thomas Hayes sat in the front row of the gallery, supported by Jennifer's parents and sisters. The physical and emotional toll of the past 19 months was evident in his appearance. Friends would later describe him as a shell of the man he had been, someone going through the motions of daily existence without any genuine engagement with life. In her opening statement, Prosecutor Morrison addressed the jury directly, her voice measured but carrying an emotional weight that reflected the gravity of the case. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the murder of a mother and her young daughter in their own home on a Sunday morning when they should have been safe. Jennifer Hayes welcomed her husband's cousin into her home that day, offered him coffee, tried to help him with his employment problems. Her daughter Emma was working on a school project, excited about the marine biology presentation she was preparing. Within hours, both would be dead, killed by the very person they had welcomed into their home. Morrison outlined the evidence the prosecution would present: Marcus's presence at the scene during the time of the murders, the physical evidence linking him to the crime, his confession, and the absence of any other viable suspect or explanation. She described the brutality of the attacks, particularly emphasizing that Emma Hayes had been murdered not in a moment of rage or panic, but as a calculated decision to eliminate a witness. The defense will likely argue that Marcus Chen has psychological issues that should mitigate his culpability, Morrison told the jury. But make no mistake, the evidence will show that Marcus Chen knew exactly what he was doing. He chose to kill Jennifer Hayes. He chose to pursue her terrified 7-year-old daughter through that house and kill her too. And he chose to try to cover up his crimes, going so far as to call his cousin hours later and leave a casual voicemail as if nothing had happened. These are not the actions of someone who didn't understand what he was doing. These are the actions of someone who simply didn't care about the lives he was taking. Defense attorney Rodriguez offered a contrasting narrative in his opening statement, acknowledging the tragedy, while attempting to provide context for Marcus's actions. No one in this courtroom disputes that Jennifer and Emma Hayes died tragically, Rodriguez began. And no one disputes that Marcus Chen was present when those deaths occurred. What we will demonstrate, however, is that Marcus Chen is a profoundly damaged individual whose untreated psychological conditions, social isolation, and deteriorating mental state created a perfect storm that resulted in this tragedy. This is not an excuse for what happened, but it is crucial context for understanding how someone with no history of violence, no previous criminal record, could commit such acts. Rodriguez emphasized Marcus's difficult background, his struggles with employment and social integration, and the psychological evaluations that had identified significant mental health issues. He suggested that while Marcus might be guilty of a crime, the question of which crime, and whether he possessed the necessary mental state for first-degree murder, remained open. The prosecution's case. The prosecution spent the first 2 weeks of trial systematically building their case through witness testimony and physical evidence. Detective Sarah Martinez was the first major witness, walking the jury through the investigation from the initial crime scene discovery through Marcus's confession. Using photographs, diagrams, and physical evidence, Martinez reconstructed the events of September 17, 2021, creating a timeline that left little doubt about Marcus's guilt. She described the neighbor's doorbell camera footage showing Marcus arriving at the Hayes residence, the cell phone data placing him there for several hours, and the damning call he made to Thomas that afternoon. After killing 2 people, including a 7-year-old child, Martinez testified, the defendant called his cousin and left a casual voicemail about getting together that week. This demonstrates not panic or remorse, but a calculated attempt to act normally and avoid suspicion. The medical examiner's testimony provided the jury with clinical details about how Jennifer and Emma Hayes died, though Judge Richardson carefully limited the graphic nature of photographs that could be shown, allowing only diagrams and non-explicit images to illustrate Dr. Robert Chen's findings. Both victims died from blunt force trauma to the head, Dr. Chen testified. The injuries were severe and would have been immediately incapacitating. Jennifer Hayes had multiple wounds, indicating she was struck numerous times. Emma Hayes was struck at least 3 times, with fatal force. When asked about the defensive wounds found on both victims, Dr. Chen explained that these injuries suggested both Jennifer and Emma had been conscious and aware during at least the initial stages of their attacks, a detail that added to the horror of their final moments. Perhaps the most impactful prosecution witness was Patricia Morrison, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies. Her testimony was emotional but composed, describing the Hayes family as wonderful neighbors and expressing the trauma of finding them dead in their home. Jennifer was one of the kindest people I've ever known, Patricia testified, her voice breaking slightly. She was always thinking of others, always willing to help. And Emma was such a bright, curious little girl. To think of what happened to them, in their own home, by someone they trusted. She paused, unable to continue for a moment. Prosecutor Morrison gently guided Patricia through her testimony about seeing Marcus arrive that morning, her later welfare check at Thomas's request, and the terrible discovery she made. Patricia's genuine grief and the clear impact the murders had on her helped humanize the victims for the jury, transforming them from abstract names into real people whose loss mattered. The defense strategy, the defense team faced an uphill battle given Marcus's confession and the overwhelming physical evidence against him. Their strategy centered on questioning his mental state and capacity, arguing for a verdict of guilty, but of a lesser charge than first-degree murder. The defense called several psychological experts who testified about Marcus's various diagnosed and suspected mental health conditions. Dr. Michael Brennan repeated many of the findings from his evaluation, emphasizing Marcus's profound social difficulties and what he characterized as a dissociative disorder that affected his ability to process emotional information normally. It is as Mr. Chen's brain doesn't process emotional data the way most people's do, Dr. Brennan testified. When confronted with the horror of what he had done, he couldn't engage with it emotionally because that capacity is simply absent or severely impaired in his psychological makeup. The defense also called Marcus's former employers and acquaintances, attempting to establish a pattern of social difficulties and deteriorating mental health in the months leading up to the murders. While these witnesses confirmed that Marcus had struggled socially and professionally, under cross-examination, they also acknowledged that they had never seen him behave violently or in ways that suggested he might be dangerous. The defense's most controversial decision was whether to have Marcus testify in his own defense. After extensive consultation, they ultimately decided against it, concerned that his flat affect and inability to express appropriate emotions would only reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a cold-blooded killer rather than someone suffering from genuine psychological impairment. Thomas Hayes takes the stand. The most emotionally charged moment of the trial came when Thomas Hayes was called to testify. He entered the courtroom moving slowly, as if each step required conscious effort. The man who had once been described by friends as vibrant and engaged now appeared hollow, his eyes carrying a weight that seemed almost unbearable. Prosecutor Morrison approached him with visible compassion, understanding that she was asking him to relive the worst day of his life while sitting in the same room as the man who had destroyed his family. Thomas was sworn in, his voice barely audible as he took the oath. "Mr. Hayes, I know this is incredibly difficult," Morrison began gently. "Can you tell the jury about your family, about Jennifer and Emma?" Thomas took a deep breath before speaking. "Jennifer was my best friend," he said, his voice stronger than it had been moments before, as if speaking about them gave him strength. "We met in college, and from our first conversation, I knew she was someone special. She was kind in a way that most people aren't, genuinely interested in everyone she met. She made everyone feel valued." He described how Jennifer had been an exceptional mother, patient and creative, always finding ways to turn ordinary moments into opportunities for Emma to learn and grow. He spoke of Emma's intelligence, her endless curiosity, her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. His voice broke when he mentioned finding her school project materials scattered in the hallway. The dolphins and whales she had been so excited about, now evidence in a murder investigation. Morrison carefully walked Thomas through the timeline of September 17th, from his early morning departure to his growing concern when Jennifer didn't answer his calls, and finally, to his return home to discover his family had been murdered. When asked about his cousin Marcus, Thomas's composure wavered significantly. "Marcus was family," Thomas said, his voice now carrying an edge of anger that hadn't been present before. "I tried to help him when he moved to Portland. I introduced him to people who could help his career. Jennifer welcomed him into our home, fed him, tried to make him feel included. And he—" Thomas stopped, unable to continue for several seconds. "He killed them. He killed my wife and my daughter in our home, and then he called me that afternoon and left a voicemail like nothing had happened." The pain in Thomas's voice as he spoke these words resonated throughout the courtroom. Several jurors were visibly affected, and even Judge Richardson appeared moved by the testimony. Marcus Chen, sitting at the defense table, showed no visible reaction, his expression as neutral as it had been throughout the trial. During cross-examination, defense attorney Rodriguez treated Thomas with respect, acknowledging his loss while asking necessary questions about Marcus's behavior and mental state during family interactions. Rodriguez attempted to establish that there had been signs of Marcus's psychological struggles that the family might have noticed, but not understood as indicators of serious mental illness. "Mr. Hayes, did you ever notice anything unusual about Marcus's behavior during family gatherings?" Rodriguez asked. Thomas considered this carefully. He was always a bit awkward socially, he admitted. He didn't always pick up on social cues, and sometimes his responses to things seemed off. But lots of people are socially awkward. That doesn't make them murderers. This response, while honest, undermined the defense's attempt to portray Marcus as obviously mentally ill in ways that should have been apparent to those around him. If his own family hadn't recognized signs of dangerous psychological dysfunction, it was difficult to argue that Marcus himself hadn't been capable of understanding his own actions. As Thomas was excused from the witness stand, he paused briefly near the defense table. For a long moment, he stared at Marcus, perhaps hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign of remorse or recognition of the devastation he had caused. Marcus looked up briefly, their eyes meeting for just a second, before Marcus looked away without expression. Thomas shook his head slowly and left the courtroom, the weight of betrayal adding another layer to his already unbearable grief. The verdict after 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of closing arguments. The case went to the jury on April the 28th, 2023. Judge Richardson provided detailed instructions on the various possible verdicts, from first-degree murder to lesser-included offenses, and the legal standards required for each. Prosecutor Morrison's closing argument focused on the premeditation evident in Marcus's actions, the calculated nature of Emma's murder, and his attempts to cover up his crimes. This was not a spontaneous act, she told the jury. After killing Jennifer Hayes, Marcus Chen made a choice. He could have fled. He could have called for help. Instead, he pursued a terrified 7-year-old child through that house and killed her to eliminate a witness. That is first-degree murder. Pure and simple. Defense attorney Rodriguez emphasized Marcus's psychological issues and argued that while his client was guilty of killing Jennifer and Emma Hayes, the prosecution had not proven the level of premeditation necessary for first-degree murder. Marcus Chen is a deeply troubled man whose untreated mental illness led to this tragedy, Rodriguez argued. But being troubled, even being severely mentally ill, doesn't automatically mean someone committed first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before indicating they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly when word spread, with both families returning to hear the outcome that would determine Marcus Chen's fate. As the jury filed in, their faces solemn and several appearing to have been crying, observers noted they did not look at the defendant, often considered a sign that they had found him guilty. Judge Richardson called the court to order, and the jury foreperson, a retired engineer who had served as foreperson, stood to deliver the verdict. On the count of murder in the first degree in the death of Jennifer Hayes, we, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Chen guilty. A collective exhale moved through the courtroom. Thomas Hayes closed his eyes, his hand gripping the railing in front of him. Jennifer's mother buried her face in her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. On the count of murder in the first degree in the death of Emma Hayes, we, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Chen guilty. With these words, Marcus Chen's fate was sealed. He had been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, carrying mandatory life sentences. His reaction to the verdict was minimal, a slight slumping of his shoulders, the only visible sign that he understood the significance of what had just occurred. Judge Richardson polled each juror individually, all confirming their agreement with the verdicts. He then set a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later, thanking the jury for their service and acknowledging the difficulty of the case they had been asked to decide. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Morrison spoke briefly to assembled media. Today's verdict brings a measure of justice for Jennifer and Emma Hayes, though nothing can truly compensate for their loss. The jury saw through the defense's attempts to excuse these brutal murders and recognized them for what they were: calculated acts of violence against innocent people. Thomas Hayes did not speak to reporters, leaving through a side entrance with family members. His attorney, later released a statement on his behalf. While grateful for the jury's verdict, Thomas Hayes knows that no legal outcome can bring back his beloved wife and daughter. He asks for privacy as he continues to navigate life without them. Sentencing on June 9, 2023, Marcus Chen returned to court for sentencing. The hearing began with victim impact statements, providing family members and friends an opportunity to address the court about the devastating consequences of Marcus's crimes. Jennifer's mother, Catherine Parker, spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. "My daughter was 34 years old when Marcus Chen murdered her," she began. "She should have had decades ahead of her, watching Emma grow up, maybe having more children, pursuing her passion for education. All of that was stolen by someone she had shown nothing but kindness to." Catherine described the ripple effects of Jennifer's death, how her two sisters had struggled with survivors' guilt and fear, how family gatherings now felt incomplete, how holidays had become painful reminders of who was missing. "We don't just miss her at big events," Catherine said. "We miss her every single day, in 1,000 small ways." Emma's teacher, Mrs. Allen, spoke about the impact of losing such a bright student. "Emma Hayes was the kind of child who reminded you why teaching matters," she testified. "She asked questions that made me think. She helped classmates without being asked, and she approached every day with genuine enthusiasm for learning." The world lost someone special when Marcus Chen killed that little girl. Several of Emma's classmates had written letters that were read into the record by the prosecutor. Simple expressions of a 7-year-old's grief. "I miss my friend Emma," one letter read. "She always let me play with her at recess, even when other kids didn't want to play with me. I don't understand why someone hurt her." The most powerful statement came from Thomas Hayes, who approached the podium with a folder of notes he had been preparing for weeks. His statement would last nearly 20 minutes, providing the most comprehensive public account of his grief and the ongoing impact of Marcus's crimes. "Your Honor, members of the court," Thomas began, "I've spent the last 20 months trying to understand how my cousin, someone I tried to help, someone I welcomed into my home and my family, could murder my wife and daughter. I've read the psychological evaluations, heard the expert testimony, listened to all the attempts to explain his actions. And while I now understand that Marcus has serious psychological problems, that knowledge does nothing to fill the void in my life." Thomas described waking up every morning to the crushing realization that Jennifer and Emma were gone, the silence in a house that used to be filled with laughter and conversation, the constant awareness of all the future moments they would never share. He spoke of Emma's 8th birthday, which had passed while Marcus was on trial, and how he had gone to the beach that day because Emma had loved the ocean. "I stood there looking at the water," Thomas said, his voice breaking, thinking about how Emma would have been running along the beach, collecting shells, asking me questions about every creature she saw. Instead, I was standing there alone because Marcus decided her life didn't matter as much as covering up what he had done." Thomas then addressed Marcus directly for the first time since his testimony. "You called me that afternoon, Marcus. Hours after you murdered my family, you called me and left a voicemail talking about getting together like nothing had happened. That call, more than anything else, showed me that you knew exactly what you had done, and you simply didn't care. I don't know if you're capable of remorse. The experts disagree about that. But I know that whether or not you feel sorry, my family is still gone, and I have to live with that loss every single day for the rest of my life." As Thomas concluded and returned to his seat, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Marcus himself, who sat expressionless, apparently unmoved by the pain his actions had caused. The defense presented their own arguments for sentencing, with Attorney Rodriguez urging the court to consider Marcus's mental health issues, and recommending that the life sentences be served concurrently rather than consecutively, potentially allowing for parole consideration after 30 years rather than 60. Prosecutor Morrison argued forcefully for consecutive sentences. Your Honor, the defendant committed two separate, deliberate murders. Jennifer Hayes and Emma Hayes were two distinct human beings whose lives had independent value. Justice demands that each murder be treated as the separate crime it was, with separate sentences to reflect the magnitude of harm inflicted. After considering all arguments, Judge Richardson delivered his sentencing decision. His remarks were measured, but reflected the gravity of the crimes and their impact on the community. Marcus Chen, you have been convicted by a jury of 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The evidence presented at trial established that you murdered Jennifer Hayes and her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, in their home, in a manner that reflected calculation and a disturbing absence of normal human empathy. While I have considered the psychological evaluations suggesting you suffer from various mental health conditions, these conditions do not excuse your actions or justify leniency. Judge Richardson then pronounced sentence. On each count of murder in the first degree, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. These sentences shall run consecutively. Having considered the overwhelming evidence and the extreme depravity of your actions, this court must impose a sentence that reflects the gravity of the harm you have caused. Therefore, on all counts, you are sentenced to a total term of 200 years, effectively natural life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentence meant that Marcus Chen, at age 29, would spend the remainder of his life in prison. As he was led from the courtroom, he showed no visible reaction to the sentence, maintaining the same emotional detachment that had characterized his behavior throughout the legal proceedings. The aftermath. In the months and years following Marcus Chen's conviction and sentencing, the Portland community gradually moved from shock and horror toward healing and remembrance, though the wounds left by the murders would never fully close. Thomas Hayes sold the family home, unable to live in the space where Jennifer and Emma had been murdered. He relocated to a different neighborhood in Portland, closer to Jennifer's family, finding some comfort in maintaining those connections. Friends reported that Thomas struggled with depression and survivor's guilt, questions of whether there had been warning signs he should have noticed, ways he might have prevented the tragedy. I replay everything in my mind, Thomas told a counselor during one of his sessions he had begun attending at the urging of family members concerned about his mental state. I think about every interaction with Marcus, looking for signs I missed. I wonder if I shouldn't have gone to that retreat, if I should have been there to protect them. The rational part of my brain knows I couldn't have predicted this, but the emotional part keeps asking, what if? With the support of Jennifer's family and close friends, Thomas eventually established the Jennifer and Emma Hayes Foundation, dedicated to supporting childhood education and marine biology programs, causes that had been important to both victims. The foundation provided scholarships for students pursuing marine science and funded educational programs at local schools. I needed to find some way to honor them that went beyond just grieving, Thomas explained at the foundation's first fundraising event, held on what would have been Emma's 9th birthday. Jennifer believed in the power of education to change lives, and Emma dreamed of becoming a marine biologist to help protect ocean animals. This foundation lets their values and dreams continue to make a positive impact. The foundation grew over the years, eventually funding a marine science program at Emma's former elementary school and providing scholarships to multiple students pursuing marine biology at Oregon universities. Each scholarship recipient received not just financial support, but also information about Emma Hayes and her dreams, ensuring that her memory lived on through the achievements of students who might not otherwise have had access to such opportunities. The Hayes murders also prompted broader discussions in Portland about mental health resources and the challenges of identifying potentially dangerous individuals before they act violently. Several community organizations launched initiatives aimed at improving mental health screening and treatment access, particularly for young adults who might be struggling with social isolation and psychological issues. Marcus Chen's family faced their own difficult path. His parents, who had attended every day of the trial, struggled with the dual burden of having lost family members to violence and knowing their son was responsible. They maintained minimal contact with Thomas, sending occasional letters expressing their grief and apologizing for what Marcus had done, though they knew no apology could ever be adequate. George and Linda Chen eventually moved away from Portland, unable to remain in a community where they would always be known as the parents of the man who had murdered his cousin's family. In a statement released through an attorney several years after the trial, they expressed their ongoing anguish. "We live every day knowing our son took 2 innocent lives. We love Jennifer and Emma, and we are devastated by what Marcus did. We will never understand how the child we raised could commit such acts, and we carry the burden of that knowledge with us always." Marcus in prison. Marcus Chen began serving his sentence at Oregon State Penitentiary, the state's only maximum security facility. Prison officials initially placed him in administrative segregation for his own protection, as inmates who harm children often face violence from other prisoners. Eventually, he was moved to general population, but remained largely isolated, showing little interest in participating in prison programs or forming relationships with other inmates. Mental health professionals within the correctional system continued working with Marcus, attempting to help him develop greater insight into his actions and their impact. Progress reports indicated minimal change in his psychological presentation, with therapists noting his continued inability to demonstrate genuine empathy or remorse. Mr. Chen can intellectually acknowledge that he killed 2 people and that this caused suffering to others, one therapist wrote in a report filed 3 years after his incarceration. However, his understanding remains purely cognitive. He shows no emotional engagement with the reality of what he has done. When asked about Jennifer and Emma Hayes, he speaks about them in abstract terms, as if discussing characters in a story rather than real people whose lives he ended. Marcus's behavior in prison was described as compliant but emotionally disconnected. He followed rules, avoided conflicts, and participated minimally in required activities, but made no effort to engage meaningfully with rehabilitation programs or other inmates. Prison staff noted that he spent most of his free time reading or watching television, showing preference for documentaries and educational programming, but avoiding any content that dealt with crime or violence. In the years following his incarceration, Marcus received occasional visits from his parents, though these became less frequent over time as his parents aged and found the visits emotionally overwhelming. He received no visits from other family members, having been effectively disowned by extended family who could not reconcile their relationship with him after what he had done. 5 years later, on the 5th anniversary of the murders, September 17, 2026, Thomas Hayes organized a memorial event at Riverside Park, near the home where Jennifer and Emma had died. The event drew hundreds of community members, many who had never known the Hayes family personally, but who had been moved by their story and wanted to show support. Thomas spoke briefly at the memorial, his words reflecting the complex journey of grief he had traveled over the past 5 years. "Jennifer and Emma should be here today," he said, addressing the assembled crowd. Emma would be 12 years old now, probably starting middle school, still passionate about marine biology, still asking a million questions about everything. Jennifer would be watching her grow with pride, continuing her work in education, making everyone around her feel valued and loved. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. I've learned over these 5 years that grief doesn't have a timeline or an end point. Some days are harder than others. Some moments, I can think about them and smile at memories. Other times, the loss feels as fresh as it did that first terrible day. But I've also learned that love persists beyond death, that the impact they had on this world continues through everyone who knew them and through the work we do to honor their memory. The memorial included the release of biodegradable balloons with messages written by children from Emma's school, a tree planting ceremony in honor of both victims, and the announcement of the Foundation's latest scholarship recipients. Among those receiving scholarships was a young woman who had been in Emma's class and who had chosen to pursue marine biology, partly inspired by her late classmate's passion. Emma Hayes was my friend, the young woman said when accepting her scholarship. She made science fun and exciting. Every time I'm in the ocean studying marine life, I think about how much Emma would have loved this. I carry her memory with me, and it pushes me to work harder and learn more. In some way, her dream is continuing through me and others like me. This sentiment, the idea that victims could live on through the positive impact they had made, and through those who carried forward their dreams and values, became a central theme in how the community chose to remember Jennifer and Emma Hayes. Rather than being defined solely by how they died, they were celebrated for how they had lived, and the ripples of goodness they had created that continued expanding outward. Legal appeals Marcus Chen's defense team filed multiple appeals in the years following his conviction, arguing various grounds for overturning the verdict or reducing the sentence. They challenged the admission of certain evidence, argued that his mental health issues should have resulted in a lesser conviction, and contended that consecutive life sentences constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Each appeal was carefully considered and ultimately denied by appellate courts. The Oregon Court of Appeals found that the trial had been conducted properly, that Marcus had been competent to stand trial, and that his sentence, while severe, was appropriate given the nature of his crimes, and particularly the calculated murder of a child. In their decision, the appellate judges wrote, "While we acknowledge the defendant suffers from psychological conditions that may have contributed to his actions, the evidence overwhelmingly established that he understood the wrongfulness of what he was doing. The murder of Emma Hayes, committed specifically to eliminate a witness, demonstrated a level of calculation and awareness inconsistent with claims of diminished capacity. The trial court's sentence, while severe, reflects the gravity of these crimes and the profound harm inflicted on the victims and their surviving family members." With the exhaustion of his direct appeals, Marcus Chen's hopes for release or sentence reduction effectively ended. Barring extraordinary circumstances, he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. The broader impact the murders of Jennifer and Emma Hayes had ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate family and community. The case became a reference point in discussions about several broader social issues. The challenges of identifying potentially dangerous individuals before they act violently, the limitations of mental health intervention in preventing violence, and the devastating impact of family violence on surviving members. Criminal justice professionals use the case in training programs, examining what warning signs might have been present and whether earlier intervention could have prevented the tragedy. Marcus Chen's online search history, his employment difficulties, his social isolation, and his deteriorating mental state all represented potential red flags, yet none had risen to a level that would have triggered intervention or made anyone suspect he was capable of extreme violence. Mental health advocates used the case to argue for better resources and more accessible treatment options for individuals struggling with psychological issues. Marcus Chen slipped through every safety net we have, one advocate noted in a panel discussion about the case. He had insurance, lived in a city with mental health resources, had family members who cared about him. But he stopped taking his medication, didn't follow up with treatment, and became increasingly isolated. We need better systems for identifying and helping people like him before tragedy occurs. Others pointed to the limitations of intervention, noting that mental health treatment cannot be forced on competent adults who choose not to seek it, and that most people with mental health conditions never become violent. The challenge of balancing individual liberty with public safety and the difficulty of predicting which troubled individuals might become dangerous remained unresolved questions that the Hayes case highlighted but could not answer. Thomas Hayes, 10 years later. A decade after the murders, Thomas Hayes had managed to build a new life, though one forever marked by the loss of his first family. He had eventually remarried, finding love with Rebecca, a counselor he had met through his grief support group, who had also experienced profound loss. Together they had a daughter, Grace, born 8 years after the murders. Thomas was open with friends that his second chance at family life brought both joy and complicated emotions. "I love Rebecca and Grace more than I can express," he told a close friend. "But that love doesn't diminish what I felt for Jennifer and Emma. They occupy different spaces in my heart. Some people worry that having another child means I'm forgetting Emma, but it's not like that. Grace will grow up knowing about her sister she never met, about the aunt who would have loved her." The Hayes home contained photographs of both families, Jennifer and Emma's pictures displayed prominently alongside more recent family photos. Thomas made sure that Grace, as she grew old enough to understand, learned about the sister and mother who had been part of his life before. On each anniversary of the murders, Thomas visited the memorial garden that had been established at Riverside Park, sometimes alone, sometimes with Rebecca and Grace. He would sit quietly, thinking about what Jennifer and Emma would be doing if they were still alive, imagining the conversations they might have had, the experiences they would have shared. "Grief becomes part of you," Thomas explained in an interview conducted for a documentary about family violence survivors. "It doesn't go away, but it does transform over time. I've learned to carry it differently, to integrate it into my life, rather than being overwhelmed by it. I can experience joy and still miss them desperately. I can build a new life while honoring the one that was taken from me. It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about learning to hold both realities simultaneously." The Jennifer and Emma Hayes Foundation continued to thrive under Thomas's leadership, expanding its programs and impact. By the 10th anniversary, the foundation had provided scholarships to over 50 students, funded marine biology programs at 3 schools, and created a summer camp program that combined environmental education with emotional support for children who had experienced trauma or loss. "This foundation is how I keep them alive in the world," Thomas said at the 10th anniversary gala. "Every student who receives a scholarship, every child who learns about the ocean, every teacher who has better resources to support their students, they're all part of Jennifer and Emma's legacy. What Marcus Chen took from them was their future. What we're doing through this foundation is creating futures they would have wanted to see, lives they would have been proud to touch." Conclusion: the murders of Jennifer and Emma Hayes remain one of Portland's most troubling criminal cases. A stark reminder that violence can emerge from unexpected sources and devastate lives in ways that ripple outward through families and communities for years. The case defied easy explanation or simple lessons, presenting instead a complex tapestry of mental illness, missed opportunities for intervention, and the ultimately unpredictable nature of human behavior. Marcus Chen, now approaching 40 years of age, continues serving his life sentence, his daily existence reduced to the routines and limitations of maximum security incarceration. Prison reports indicate no significant change in his psychological presentation, no breakthrough moment of understanding or genuine remorse. He exists in a kind of permanent stasis, alive but disconnected from any meaningful engagement with the impact of his actions. For Thomas Hayes and the extended families affected by these murders, life continues in the shadow of loss, marked by both ongoing grief and the resilience required to build meaning from tragedy. The foundation created in Jennifer and Emma's names represents a determination that their deaths, while senseless and unjust, would not be the end of their story. The memorial garden at Riverside Park blooms each spring with flowers tended by volunteers from the community, many of whom never knew Jennifer and Emma personally, but who recognize that remembering victims and supporting survivors matters. The garden includes a bench dedicated to Emma Hayes with a plaque reading, Emma Hayes, 2014-2021, marine biologist in Dreams, Forever in Our Hearts. On sunny days, children play near the memorial, their laughter and energy a reminder that life persists even in spaces touched by tragedy. Teachers bring classes there to learn about marine biology, connecting Emma's passion to broader lessons about environmental stewardship. Ordinary, and occasionally, Thomas Hayes sits on that bench, watching the children play, thinking about his daughter who loved the ocean and dreamed of protecting its creatures, whose life was too brief but whose impact continues to spread outward in ways both visible and immeasurable. The story of the Hayes family murders resists comfortable conclusions or redemptive arcs. There is no happy ending, no way to make sense of senseless violence, no explanation that adequately accounts for why a mother and child were murdered by someone they had shown nothing but kindness. What remains is the human capacity to endure unbearable loss, to find meaning in memory, and to insist that love and connection persist even when death attempts to sever them permanently. In a world where such tragedies occur with disturbing frequency, the Hayes case serves as a reminder of both the fragility of safety and the strength of human resilience. Jennifer and Emma Hayes did not choose to become victims, did not do anything to deserve their fate, and their loss leaves a void that can never be filled. But through the foundation that bears their names, through the students who pursue dreams similar to Emma's, and through the community that refuses to let their memory fade, their story becomes more than just one of victimhood. It becomes a testament to the enduring power of love and the determination of those left behind to create meaning from even the most meaningless violence. As Thomas Hayes continues forward, raising his daughter Grace while honoring the memory of Jennifer and Emma, he carries within him both unbearable sorrow and stubborn hope. "I will never understand why Marcus did what he did," he has said, "but I've learned that understanding isn't necessary for healing. What matters is that we remember Jennifer and Emma for who they were, not just how they died. What matters is that we continue their work in the world. What matters is that love, ultimately, proves stronger than violence." This sentiment, hard-won through years of grief and gradual healing, represents perhaps the only meaningful response to inexplicable tragedy. To remember, to honor, and to insist that the lives taken matter more than the violence that took them. And this script totals approximately 10,000 words and maintains the documentary, true crime style of the original, including detailed timeline construction, extensive character development, psychological analysis, courtroom proceedings, and community impact. The case is entirely fictional, but follows the same narrative structure and tone as the reference material.